If your so-called unique authorial voice is drawing more attention to your prose than to your plot, you aren't protecting your craft. You're smothering your story. Welcome to Talk Beta to Me, the audio companion to the blog. I'm your host, Chris Chinchilla. Every week, we take the lessons learned from the editorial desk and break down the narrative speed bumps holding your fiction back. Today on the show, Smothering Your Story, why protecting your voice is holding your manuscript back. We're unpacking the myth of the untouchable voice, looking at how unrefined prose acts like a fog over your narrative, and examining how one author cleared out the stylistic noise to get her debut novel into publishing negotiations. This episode was recorded live on X. Stick around after the core craft reading for podcast-exclusive insights, followed by our signature Something Weird trivia segment, where today we're looking at why Pablo Picasso spent his youth painting like Raphael, just so he could spend his old age painting like a child. Let's head down to the live room and talk beta. Smothering Your Story, why protecting your voice is holding your manuscript back. The myth of the untouchable voice. A piece of rampant writing advice goes, don't let editors touch your unique voice. Or, your voice is your unique selling point. Don't put it in a box. A unique voice isn't static. Instead, it develops across a spectrum and over a lifetime. Think of authors like Ayn Rand, Ursula K. Le Guin, and Junot Diaz, whose work critics often divide between their early and later years. Fans of these authors know their voices changed significantly as their craft matured. We all began with a unique voice, but it's often raw and unpolished, and manifests in poor mechanics and self-indulgence. If we try too hard to smooth it over, our voice might lose its distinctiveness. If we fight too hard to maintain it, our voice might find itself without an audience. The popular advice not to let editors touch your unique voice could use a touch of editing. If our voice draws attention away from the story and onto itself, we're robbing the reader of their immersion. If we craft our voice through developmental editing, we find its purity and we invite the reader into the story. In the Trenches, the case of the over-decorated manuscript. One of my clients, Delia, hired me to read her novel 5 times in 1 year. Her initial draft commanded beautiful prose, but it suffocated the narrative. Heavy, overbearing alliteration and ornate phrasing drew attention to the writing and away from the story. Her highly unique style gave me pause. I had never seen such a command of English before. The tight, evocative alliteration stunned me and fit the story's context perfectly, and I wanted to protect it. However, I felt as though I were in a room looking out a window through thick blinds, trying to glimpse the story occurring outside, with slashes interrupting a clear view. Early in the draft, I offered a few alternatives to avoid the alliteration, reminding Delia that by tightening the concept into a solid word, for example, poetry of poverty became impoverished, the story's pace increases, the word count drops, and clarity reigns supreme, culminating in a more immersive reader experience. Unlike casual readers or beta readers, developmental editors often offer direct line rewrites. However, I quickly realized I'd be editing every sentence. A good editor knows when editing crosses the line into overwriting the author's voice. I switched tactics. Amid early inline comments, I had explained the virtue and value of smoothing out the prose's ornateness, so I leaned on those explanations and shifted from rewrites to highlights. Yellow highlights indicated alliteration to cut or reduce, purple highlights indicated lavish prose to state more directly, and green highlights indicated repetition to streamline. I returned a colorful manuscript to Delia. When the prose fog lifts, the story appears. We used this highlighting system in the remaining drafts. Highlights lessened with each draft until the final edit resulted in only a handful. I noticed a drastic change, not just in the voice, which had sharpened into swift, crisp, dramatic prose, but in the editing experience. Like fog, the heavy prose had made it difficult to see the story beneath. As that fog lifted with each subsequent draft, the story itself became sharper. I noticed beats, threads, and arcs I hadn't caught before. Our later drafts focused primarily on story development, and by the final collaborative draft, Delia's story had tightened into a dramatic, heart-pounding narrative. The actual story changed little. Delia had a magnificent vision from the start, but its execution had shifted significantly. The blade of her unique voice had not been broken or blemished, forgive the alliteration. Instead, it had become shining, razor-sharp steel. So, how do you clear out the prose fog without stripping away your authorial identity? That's next. Looking for a beta reader to give you honest, polite, and objective feedback on your novel's plot and character arcs? My beta reading service includes inline chapter comments and a detailed 2 to 4 page reader report. Head over to talkbetatome.com for beta reading or editing services and mention the code BETA10 in your initial message to get 10% off your first order. Master the scales before you play jazz. To use a musical analogy, pianists don't express unique voice by mashing keys randomly. They master scales, precision, and dynamics so their true expression can come through cleanly. For writers, precision often means cutting or streamlining prose. Stephen King famously echoed Arthur Quiller Couch's classic mandate to kill your darlings. Misinterpretations suggest this means killing off favorite characters to stun readers and keep them guessing, a la George R.R. Martin. Its actual meaning is to cut the lines, dialogue, and narration you love most. A line you think is show-stopping fantastic is ripe for the cutting board. Why? Because it's show-stopping. It calls attention away from the story and onto the prose. Cut it. At least for this draft. 5 drafts later, you can always resurrect it. Delia took about 90% of my suggestions. I recall one line in particular that, despite my repeated highlights and comments, she refused to cut. During our final collaboration, the draft was so tight that the line I'd encouraged cutting ended up working incredibly well. Ironically, because the surrounding prose had been streamlined, that bold, alliterative sentence landed with superhero impact. It didn't stop the show, though. Instead, it gave attention to a crucial story beat at just the right moment. Delia refused to kill that darling, but it survived only because of the sacrifice of the thousands of other darlings she had ruthlessly edited. Protecting your voice doesn't mean shielding it from critique, but relentlessly cultivating it through editing. Critique versus command, finding the right editor. A quick note on Delia's journey. She hired multiple editors, and I saw some of the reviews they left her as a client. They openly expressed frustration that she wouldn't change her work. We've all felt the sting of offering advice that goes unheeded. Delia had hired some of them several times, and yet ultimately they complained about it. I suspect the editors tried to rewrite her work without explanation or concern for protecting her voice. Finding good editors is like finding good books. You have to mine to unearth the diamonds. Delia sidelined several of my suggestions, but she took many more. I pitched a few rewrites, which she used, but ultimately she forged a new vision of her unique voice. It's not a voice based on Chris's feedback. Instead, it's a voice forged through craft-focused effort. I caught up with Delia recently and discovered her agent is in negotiations with a publisher for her debut novel, the one previously smeared in colorful highlights, but is now a crisp, black and white manuscript. The voice's color hasn't been stripped. Instead, it's seeped into the actual story. Sharp steel beats a glass heirloom. Let's remember that readers read for the story, not just stylistic flair, unless you're strictly writing academic or literary avant-garde. Even then, subverting narrative voice happens only once an author has mastered it. Take Picasso from the world of painting, who mastered clean, Renaissance-like artistry long before he deconstructed shapes and challenged perspective. He famously said, "It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child." Circling back to Junot Diaz, The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde is a magnum opus of unique voice. Diaz bounces between perspectives and unapologetically litters the novel with huge footnotes. Study Diaz's early work, and you'll find a mastery of clean, straightforward prose, like 1996's Drown, that his 2007 Wow performance seems to undermine. In reality, it rests firmly on a mastery of straightforward writing craft. First, gain clarity. Then, be unique. Your voice isn't a fragile heirloom you hide in a display case. It's a blade that needs to be forged and sharpened on the grindstone of editing. Stop worrying about protecting your voice out of a rebellious, avant-garde sense of purity. Put it into the trenches, let it be tested, and let it serve the story. Here is an excerpt from Delia's unedited manuscript. High Chancellor Vance nodded his head in solemn silence, his cold eyes lingering on the tapestries of the fortress of the mind. He cut a slender figure against the obsidian walls, but the calculating gleam in his gaze betrayed his covert clout. He smoothed the velvet of his grand vestments, a regal weave of Rome and royalty, as the flowing cuffs, flared like the delicate petals of a primrose, offered a fleeting glimpse of the silver metallic bangle surrounding his forearm. The council commends the Vanguard's victory in yet another swift voyage across the storm seas, he said, his tone dripping with a diplomat's refined rhetoric. Cale murmured with mockery. Too shrewd to be drawn into a petty brawl with Captain Cale, he brushed off the sharp disrespect with a phony and flattering remark, calculated to keep control over the confrontation. That was 141 words. A few notes on this. We see obvious alliteration, such as solemn silence, as well as less obvious, such as victory and voyage, and swift and storm seas, spread out over the course of a sentence. It also pops up phonetically, as in the F sounds in phony and flattering. Even character names needed adjustment, such as Captain Cale. The tight, well-crafted alliteration nevertheless serves as narrative speed bumps. We see repetitive elements, such as a heavy focus on Vance's robe and his shrewdness. While precise, they stall the scene's momentum. We see ornate prose in the tapestries of the fortress of the mind and the entire he smoothed sentence. Ornate, alliterative, repetitive prose, while highly unique, smothers an otherwise dramatic encounter between Vance and Cale. This is a prime example of the entire manuscript's language. Here are Delia's adjustments. They result partly from my inline edits and recommendations, but otherwise, Delia sharpened her own voice. High Chancellor Vance nodded, his cold eyes lingering on Cale. Vance cut a slender figure against the obsidian walls, but his calculating gaze betrayed his furtiveness. He smoothed the velvet of his robe, offering Cale a fleeting glimpse of the metallic bangle enclosing his forearm. The council praises the Vanguard's victory, Captain, he said, his tone dripping refinement. Cale mumbled an insult. Vance shrewdly brushed it off with a flattering remark. That edit is 71 words. Did you notice the metallic bangle on the forearm this time? The prose previously buried this mysterious detail amid heavy phrasing. We might have missed it entirely or dismissed it as just another lavish element of Vance's overdescribed costume. Now, clean prose excavates the detail, drawing the reader's eye to it and enticing our curiosity about its purpose and significance. That wraps up the reading. Some interesting points that came up in a related thread on X. Kyle mentioned that his biggest fear is losing words he put in a specific order for a reason. But even he acknowledges his way isn't inherently right. He said, we write words in a specific order on purpose. And there's a difference between the intention while you're writing and the reader's perception. Another phrase for this is the mind of the originator versus the mind of the recipient. It makes sense in our head. It might not make sense in the same way in the reader's head, even though every single word you chose and its order were entirely intentional. So an editor isn't removing that intention. What they're trying to do is align the execution with your intent so that the reader actually feels what you meant for them to feel. They are not looking to tell you why everything you're doing is wrong and how you need to rewrite every single line. And if they are, I highly recommend you move on from that editor. Evelyn brought up that while prose can be both clear and ornate, it takes a lot of practice. Clarity and ornamentation aren't mutually exclusive, but they operate on a hierarchy. If you lead with fancy, you risk building a fog over your narrative. But if you lead with clear, then any ornamentation you add later lands like a spotlight rather than an obstacle. Sean brought up a great point on the X thread. He said, when we read a master of stylistic prose, this isn't a direct quote, but he was saying, when we read a master of stylistic prose, we're rarely reading an untouched draft. We're typically reading the polished output of a high-level collaborative partnership between an author and an editor who knew how to trim without stripping out the soul. One wonderful example of the value of an editor comes from The Great Gatsby. So Maxwell Perkins is the editor behind F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. When Max Perkins read the initial draft of Gatsby, he didn't grab a red pen and start rewriting the iconic prose. Instead, he wrote this famous multi-page letter telling Fitzgerald that Gatsby is vague. He emerges as a phantom rather than a person. So Perkins identified the structural fog so Fitzgerald could sharpen the portrait of Gatsby. Originally, Fitzgerald actually dumped a lot of backstory early in the book, and Perkins advised him to parcel out Gatsby's history in gradual pieces to build suspense. And that single structural shift transformed Gatsby from an over-explained character into the legendary figure of mystery that we know today, where even by the end of the book, we're still not sure we know the full picture or that we've been told all of the truth. So Fitzgerald was a master of poetic, evocative sentence craft, arguably one of the greatest stylists in American literature, still taught to this day, of course. But his prose couldn't mask structural flaws. Max Perkins proved that developmental editing isn't about wrangling or domesticating an author's voice. It's about fixing the foundation so the author's voice can actually stand. And that wraps up our live community session for the week. If you want to grab the mic yourself, ask a question about your current draft, or just hang out in the room with us, we broadcast live on X every single Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Our next live session is Wednesday, August 5th, and I'd love to see you in the room. If you want to stop guessing if your pages are working and get an objective, disciplined eye on your manuscript, head over to talkbetatome.com to check out my one-pass developmental editing or book a one-on-one story strategy session. While you're there, be sure to check out our weekly blog posts and past episodes just like this one for more deep dives into narrative craft. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. Every month, you'll get a roundup of my latest editorial insights, plus an exclusive, subscriber-only look at part of a real manuscript, showing my actual notes and the exact polishing edits we used to make it shine. But before we go, it's time for something weird. Speaking of mastering the rules before you break them, legend has it that when a young Pablo Picasso was taking his entrance exams for the Barcelona Academy of Fine Arts at just 13 years old, he was given a month to complete a classical masterwork drawing. He finished the entire thing in a single day, and it was so technically perfect that the professors skipped him ahead into the advanced classes. Turns out, you really do have to learn how to paint the classical portrait before you can start throwing eyes on the side of a face. I'm Chris Chinchilla. Thanks for listening. See you next week.